initially, we tend to look at major sporting events and religious holidays to understand what the trends are and how these events really shape the travel behaviors in the run-up to something like the World Cup. Specifically for Doha, what we are seeing is a significant spike in the volume of searches that are being made, predominantly for flights into Qatar in the month of November. To give you some context around this, we usually see the longer the travel lead time or the further away the flight, we tend to see the volume of searches decrease. So most people, especially with the pandemic, tend to be looking at fairly short travel lead times. So to see such a significant spike in searches for Qatar in November in itself is a really, really positive sign. I think what's really interesting is when we've seen these spikes take place. So the most recent spike we've actually seen was back in January this year. So if we look at year over year search volumes, the searches to Doha as a destination in January this year were 1,500% increased in total volume versus the previous year. And that was in the month of January, which is coinciding with the first round of ticket sales, which was on January the 19th. So it's always nice to see some correlation there between increases in search volumes around, major milestones as we run up to the World Cup. This is the most exciting part. So looking at the increased search volumes that are taking place in November, the majority of these are coming from Latin American countries, with Brazil being the dominant origin market, with around 85% of all searches for flights coming from Brazil alone. It's not hugely surprising that there's a lot of interest from these nations around the World Cup. Obviously, traditionally, these countries are football fanatics with very, very successful national teams. But this is the first time when you've had a World Cup taking place with a potentially 30-hour flight time with connections. So when we look at the usual inbound or origin markets for Gulf countries, Latin American countries don't tend to feature that often, purely because of the logistics of flying to this part of the world. And in alongside that, when you look at DMOs and destination marketing organizations and their priority markets, those Latin American countries don't feature always that strongly, again, just because of the difficulty or the long travel time to get here. So it's really exciting to see this brand new kind of spotlight being shone on Qatar as a destination from these traditionally low volume markets. At the moment, we are only looking at search data because the data tends to be a bit more robust. I think the challenge at the moment with looking specifically at booking data will be that the qualifying period for the World Cup isn't over yet. While it's very unlikely that Latin American teams won't qualify, again, I think there is still some hesitation around booking travel so far out. But given the cost of traveling from, for example, Argentina or Brazil to this region, it's not surprising that this research is taking place kind of 6 months plus out. With regards to kind of Middle East markets or GCC markets, traditionally search and booking windows to Doha as a destination have always been quite small. Or quite short, even during the height of the pandemic, when obviously there were PCR testing restrictions. So I don't see any huge changes necessarily taking place in terms of the travel lead time from the regional markets. But yes, I think there's a lot of things will be much easier now. So for example, business travel between, let's say, here in Dubai and Doha will be a lot easier now, just with those PCR restrictions obviously dropping. I think to your point also regarding the trends we're seeing from LATAM nations, you also need to consider how people will be searching and booking their travel as well. So I think a lot of people will search on OTAs, they will search on airline websites to kind of price up a trip. But there is also the opportunity to travel for the World Cup as part of kind of a tour group or a tour package as well. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out eventually, to see where people from such far away countries are and how they're choosing to book travel. To your point about lead time and whether people are booking also, I think the pandemic has afforded most travelers a very, very flexible cancellation policy if you're booking directly with a hotel or with a airline. I think there's probably a bit of hesitation around that now with the restrictions dropping as to whether these restrictions will possibly be tight or the cancellation policies will be tightened. But again, we'll have to see how that plays out over the next kind of 6 months. The African countries, but I think specifically, for example, East Africa, didn't feature prominently in the total search volumes, which means that the volume of searches coming from other origins, like I say, like LATAM and parts of this region, the GCC, has meant that they are the dominant origin markets. That's not to say that African markets are not researching, but that data I don't have specifically to hand right now. We are able to look at Africa as an origin region, but I would think because they are not featuring heavily in the top 10, top 20, for example, origin markets at the moment, that the volumes aren't significant enough there. So I would expect that to change as obviously anything you do closer to the closer you get to the event, the more and more searches will take place when more and more people start to book. But right now we're not seeing necessarily any prominent African nations feature in that top kind of origins list. I think in general, we're seeing obviously increased search volumes across the board. I think for the GCC countries specifically, we are not seeing those comparable spikes in searches. I think there's a few factors at play there. Obviously, the proximity to Qatar from this region will play a part in the fact that people aren't necessarily searching right now. And my understanding is, I think a lot of these schedules, the flight schedules for the World Cup are still being worked on in terms of which carriers will go there, what some of the routes are, if you can transit to kind of keep the cost down. I know there's been some press in the last few weeks with regards to some of the flight prices being astronomical, but I think that will settle down as obviously more routes become available. So yeah, for the time being, we're not seeing huge spikes from this region. I think that's probably in line with how this region tends to book travel anyway. If you look at, inter-regional travel between Gulf countries.